Good day. I'm Josh Ryan, licensed professional counselor, and this is Pause and Respond, a framework for emotional control, disciplined thinking, and better decisions under pressure. Today, I want to talk about something almost every one of us has experienced, but very few of us have ever stopped to examine, and that's defensiveness. Not the loud kind that's easy to recognize, the quiet kind, the kind that begins before you've spoken a single word, the kind that shows up while you're still smiling, nodding, and pretending that you're listening, even though your mind has already left the conversation. Because here's the truth: the most important conversation isn't always the one happening between two people. It's the one happening inside of you while the other person is still talking. Have you ever noticed how quickly a conversation can change? Someone says, "Can I give you some feedback?" Or maybe your spouse says, "There's something I've been wanting to talk about." The boss begins with, "I noticed something yesterday." Nothing about any of those sentences is inherently hostile. No one's yelling, no one's insulting, no one has accused you of anything. But before they've reached the second sentence, something inside you has already begun to move. Maybe your breath changes, your shoulders begin to tighten, your attention narrows, your mind quietly shifts from listening to preparing. You start collecting evidence. You remember all the things they didn't notice. You mentally rehearse the explanation before given. You begin searching for exceptions. Things like, "That's not what I meant," or "They don't know the whole story." Or maybe it's, "If they understood what happened, then they would understand." The conversation is still happening. Their words are still coming, but your attention has quietly walked away from them. You're no longer trying to understand, you're trying to survive the conversation. And most people don't even realize the shift has happened. And that's because defensiveness rarely begins with your voice. It begins with the story you're telling yourself before you even speak. It's an invisible transition. One moment, you're hearing information. The next moment, your nervous system has decided that information has become evaluation. And once that happens, everything changes. Most people think defensiveness begins when they answer. It doesn't. It begins much, much earlier. It begins in the quiet moment when your brain decides that what you're hearing might not simply be feedback, that it might be a threat. That's why two people can hear the exact same observation and respond in completely different ways. The one person pauses, they ask a question, they become curious. The other immediately explains, interrupts, minimizes, or pushes back. Their difference isn't intelligence. It isn't personality. It isn't even emotional maturity alone. The difference is what each person's nervous system believes to be at stake. Here's what I've learned after years of sitting across from individuals and couples. Your brain almost never reacts to words alone. It reacts to what those words appear to mean to you. Someone might say, "You seem distracted." Your nervous system hears, "You're failing." Someone might say, "I wish you were more present." Your mind quietly translates, "You're letting everyone down." Someone may say, "That really hurt me." And somewhere inside, your brain hears, "You're becoming the kind of person you never wanted to be." The conversation happening outside of you is often much smaller than the conversation happening inside of you. By the time you respond, you're no longer answering the sentence they spoke. You're answering the story your mind created about what those words might mean. I've seen this happen hundreds of times. A wife quietly says, I miss spending time with you. She isn't accusing, she isn't attacking, she isn't questioning her spouse's character. Simply put, she's expressing loneliness. But before she can finish, her spouse begins explaining how many hours have been worked this week. The list begins of everything that's been done for the family. The reminder of all the responsibilities that have been being carried. From the outside, it looks like someone's avoiding the conversation. But underneath, something very different is happening. And that's the spouse didn't hear, I miss you. They heard, you're failing as a partner. Those are two completely different sentences, yet they produce the exact same emotional reaction because the nervous system filled in the space between them. And this is where I think we misunderstand defensiveness. Most criticism doesn't hurt because it's accurate. It hurts because we confuse behavior with identity. Somewhere along the way, many of us learned that making a mistake meant being a mistake. That disappointing someone meant becoming a disappointment. That getting something wrong somehow changed who you are. So when someone points out something you've done, our nervous system reacts as though they're describing who we are. And once identity enters the conversation, curiosity quietly leaves. The people who struggle most with defensiveness rarely wake up intending to be difficult. In fact, many of them care deeply about doing the right thing. They want healthy relationships. They want to communicate well. They want to be good spouses, good parents, good leaders. That's precisely why criticism feels so personal. When your identity is wrapped around being those things, even gentle feedback can feel like evidence that you're becoming the opposite. Defensiveness isn't always arrogance. More often, it's fear wearing the clothes of certainty. And that's the shift I hope you'll begin making today. Instead of asking, how do I stop being defensive? I want you to ask a different question. What is my mind trying so hard to protect? Because the moment you stop seeing defensiveness as the enemy and begin seeing it as information, something changes. You become curious instead of ashamed. You stop trying to win every conversation, and you begin trying to understand what your reactions have been protecting all along. That shift from protection to understanding is where emotional control truly begins. Now imagine this. Your spouse texts you in the middle of the day. Can we talk tonight? That's it. 4 words. No accusation, no criticism, no explanation. Just 4 ordinary words. And yet, before the afternoon is over, you've already imagined 6 different conversations. You've defended yourself against things they haven't said. You've remembered mistakes from 3 years ago. You've started gathering explanations, justifications, and evidence to support your case. By the time you sit down together that evening, you're emotionally prepared for a fight that may never happen. And that's because nothing dangerous has actually occurred. But something inside you has already decided that danger is possible. And that's how quickly the nervous system begins writing stories. One of the biggest misconceptions about emotional reactions is that people believe their brain is designed to discover the truth. Well, it's not. Your brain is a prediction machine. Long before it decides whether something is true, it decides whether something might be dangerous. Those are two very different, distinct jobs. Truth asks, what is actually happening? Prediction asks, what do I need to prepare for? And when emotions are involved, prediction almost always arrives before certainty. I've often told clients something that surprises them at first. Your nervous system would rather be wrong than be surprised. Now think about that. Your brain isn't trying to make you happy. It isn't even trying to help you win every conversation. Its first responsibility is much simpler than that. It's simply just to try to keep you safe. And if it has to choose between seeing danger that isn't really there or missing danger that might be, it will usually choose caution, even when caution costs you connection. That's why emotionally charged conversations feel so different from ordinary ones. Your nervous system isn't waiting for evidence. It's responding to the possibility of something. A change in someone's tone, a pause before they answer, a disappointed expression, a deep sigh, crossed arms. Sometimes your body has already decided something is wrong before your conscious mind has even figured out what was said. The story your brain predicts usually arrives before the facts do. And once that story begins, your emotions naturally begin organizing themselves around it. I've watched people spend 15 minutes defending themselves against something the other person never intended. Not because they were dishonest or selfish or they wanted conflict, but because fear quietly finished the sentence before the other person had a chance to. I've seen a husband prepared to defend his commitment to his family when all his wife wanted was one uninterrupted evening together. I've watched a parent become defensive over a teenager's simple frustration because somewhere inside they heard you're failing as a parent. The conversation they responded to wasn't the one that was spoken. It was the one their nervous system predicted. This is where identity quietly enters the picture again. Your nervous system isn't simply protecting your body. It's protecting the version of yourself you've spent years trying to become. If being a good father or a good mother is central to your identity, then hearing you seem distracted lately doesn't simply sound like feedback. It can feel like losing a piece of who you are. If you've built your identity around being dependable, and someone says, I don't feel like I can count on you, that doesn't sound like one difficult conversation. It sounds like your entire character is being questioned in that moment. And that's why defensiveness feels so much bigger than the words themselves. You're not protecting your opinion. You're protecting and defending your identity. And people often assume emotionally secure people don't feel criticized. The opposite is actually true. They feel criticized just as deeply as everyone else. The difference is they don't confuse feedback with identity. They've learned that making a mistake doesn't make them a mistake, that disappointing someone doesn't make them a disappointment, that being corrected or instructed isn't the same thing as being rejected, that separation changes everything, because when your identity remains secure, your curiosity can stay present. Sometimes nothing dangerous is happening. It may only be something uncomfortable, and those aren't the same thing. But your nervous system doesn't always know the difference, especially if your past taught you that difficult conversations usually ended with rejection, shame, or conflict. That's one of the hidden costs of unresolved emotional pain. Yesterday quietly begins interrupting today. A conversation with your spouse starts sounding like conversations you had growing up. A performance review starts feeling like every time you were told you weren't good enough. A friend's disappointment feels strangely familiar, even if they've never spoken to you that way before. The past at that point has quietly walked into the room without introduction. One of the most freeing realizations you'll ever have is this: not every emotional reaction belongs entirely to the present moment. Sometimes today's conversation is waking up yesterday's experience. And that's why emotional maturity isn't just learning better communication skills. It's learning to recognize when your history has quietly joined the conversation without your permission. Because if you never recognize that, you'll keep expecting today's relationships to protect wounds they didn't create. And eventually the people closest to you will spend more time defending themselves against your reactions than actually talking with you. Every time you pause long enough to ask, what am I protecting right now? You weaken the old pattern. Every time you choose curiosity instead of certainty, you teach your nervous system something it may have never learned before. That not every uncomfortable conversation ends in rejection. Not every difficult moment ends in loss. Not every piece of feedback is an attack. And eventually, your body begins believing what your mind has been trying to tell you all along: that you are safe enough to stay in the conversation. But here's the paradox. If defensiveness is trying so hard to protect us, why does it so often damage the very relationships we're trying to save? Because the strategy that feels safest in the moment often creates the greatest distance over time. And that's where we're going to go to next. Have you ever walked away from an argument convinced you had explained yourself perfectly, only to discover the other person felt less understood than when the conversation started? That's one of the cruelest ironies of defensiveness. The harder you work to protect the relationship, the more disconnected it becomes. Because what feels like protection inside of you often feels like rejection to the person sitting across from you. And that is one of the hardest truths about emotional maturity. Good intentions do not always produce healthy outcomes. By now, we've established something important. Defensiveness isn't usually about winning an argument. It's about protecting identity, protecting character, or maybe your place in the relationship. The intention is rarely selfish. The intention is usually survival. But relationships don't experience our intentions. They experience our responses. And those are not always the same thing. One of the hardest lessons we learn as adults is this: people experience our impact far more than they experienced our intentions. We live inside our intentions. We know what we meant. We know what we were trying to say. We know the stress that we're carrying or the fear that we're feeling. But the people around us don't live inside our intentions. They live inside our behavior. And that's why explaining what you meant rarely heals what someone experienced. Because while you were describing your intentions, they were still carrying the impact. I've watched this unfold in counseling more times than I can count. A wife finally gathers enough courage to say, "I don't feel very connected to you anymore." There's a moment of silence, just enough of vulnerability to exist. And then almost immediately, "I've been working 60 hours a week. I'm exhausted. I'm done. I'm doing everything I can." And while none of those statements are false, right, every one of them may be completely accurate. None of them answered the loneliness she just trusted enough to share. The facts were accurate, yet the connection was missed. That's what defensiveness does. It quietly changes the subject. Someone says, "That hurt me." The conversation becomes, "Let me explain why I did it." Someone says, "I felt alone." The response becomes, "You don't understand everything I've been dealing with." Someone says, "I miss you." And the reply becomes, "Why are you acting like I never do anything right?" Without realizing it, the conversation slowly shifts away from understanding another person's experience and becomes an effort to protect your own. I've often told couples that defensiveness has a way of turning conversations into courtrooms. Every sentence becomes evidence. Every explanation becomes testimony. Every misunderstanding somehow becomes a case to win. And every memory becomes another exhibit supporting your position. But the bottom line is relationships aren't strengthened by winning cases. They're strengthened by understanding each other's experiences. No one leaves a courtroom feeling deeply connected. People leave courtrooms either feeling victorious or defeated. Healthy relationships are not trying to produce winners. Let me say that again. Healthy relationships are not trying to produce winners. They're simply trying to produce understanding. And this is why defensiveness is so deceptive. It promises protection, but it often creates the very thing it's trying to prevent. Ironically, defensiveness often creates the rejection it's trying to avoid. Think about that. Most people don't pull away because someone made a mistake. They pull away because they no longer feel emotionally safe bringing that mistake into the relationship. Eventually, they just stop saying, "Can we talk?" They stop sharing disappointment. They stop expressing hurt. And that's not because everything is fine. It's because they've learned that vulnerability usually turns into a debate. And when vulnerability no longer feels safe, connection begins to disappear. The more fragile your identity feels, the more expensive curiosity becomes. Because curiosity requires something incredibly difficult. It requires the willingness to admit, maybe I don't understand this yet. For someone whose identity feels secure, that's just uncomfortable. For someone whose identity feels threatened, it can be terrifying. And that's why emotionally mature people aren't people who never feel defensive. They're people whose sense of self is stable enough that they can remain curious even when feedback is uncomfortable. Think about the people you trust most. It probably isn't because they've never hurt you or because they've always said the perfect thing. It's when they did hurt you, they stayed, they listened, they didn't rush to explain, they didn't immediately defend themselves. They made your experience feel important enough to sit with. And that's emotional safety. Not perfection, but presence. Same thing is true for children. Children don't learn emotional safety by growing up with perfect parents. They learn it by watching imperfect parents repair. When a child hears a parent say, "You're right, I didn't handle that well," something remarkable happens. The child learns that mistakes don't end relationships. They learn that accountability isn't weakness. They learn that love is strong enough to survive honesty. Those moments become part of how they learn to relate to themselves and eventually to the people that they go on to love. And maybe that's why this matters so much. Because defensiveness doesn't just shape today's conversations. It shapes tomorrow's relationship. Every defensive response teaches people something. It teaches them whether it's safe to be honest with you, whether it's safe to bring you disappointment, whether it's safe to tell you the truth. And that's a much bigger responsibility than simply winning an argument. Now, here's the sentence I hope stays with you long after this episode is over. The walls that protect you from pain also block you from connection. Every explanation before empathy adds a brick to that wall. Every moment of certainty before curiosity adds another brick. Every time protection becomes more important than presence, eventually you've built something that feels incredibly safe, but it's incredibly lonely. Because walls don't just keep out pain, they keep people out too. And the strongest relationships are not built by people who never become defensive. They're built by people who recognize defensiveness before it becomes the loudest voice in the room. Because connection begins the moment protection stops leading the conversation. And that's where trust is, and that's where repair begins. And that's where emotional control starts becoming something much deeper than simply managing your reactions. It becomes the decision to value the relationship more than the need to be right. So how do emotionally people actually do that? What changes in those few seconds between feeling criticized and choosing how to respond? And this is important because understanding defensiveness is only the beginning. The real transformation happens when you learn a different way to meet those moments. And that's where we're going to finish. Imagine how different your relationship would feel if you no longer had to spend so much energy protecting yourself. Imagine walking into a difficult conversation without rehearsing your defense before the person even finishes speaking. Imagine hearing feedback without immediately wondering what it says about your worth. Imagine being able to stay present even when the conversation becomes uncomfortable. That is emotional freedom. And it's much closer than most people realize. Because emotional security isn't built when life becomes easier. It's built when difficult conversations stop deciding who you are. By now, I hope one thing has become clear. The goal was never to become someone who never feels defensive. That's not realistic. You're going to be engaged and have conversations that sting. Moments where someone misunderstands you, times when criticism feels unfair, days when you're tired, stressed, overwhelmed, or just emotionally worn down. The goal isn't to eliminate those moments. The goal is to stop letting those moments decide how you respond. Because emotional maturity isn't measured by what you feel. It's measured by what leads you after you feel it. People often assume emotionally healthy people possess some extraordinary level of patience. They don't. Their heart still races, their stomach still tightens, their thoughts still speed up. Their first instinct is often the same as everyone else's. The difference is that somewhere between the trigger and the response, they've learned to create some space. Not because they were born with that ability, but because they practice it. And that's why I often say emotional control is not a personality trait. It's a discipline. And every discipline is built one repetition at a time. I want to leave you with one practice, not 5, 10, just one. Because under pressure, you're probably not going to remember 10 different strategies anyways. However, you may remember one. I call it 4-second pause. Not because 4 seconds is magical, but because 4 seconds is often enough time for your thinking brain to join the conversation, long enough for prediction to slow down and observation to begin, long enough for your values to catch up with your emotions. And here's what those 4 seconds look like. Second 1, notice your body, not your argument, your body. Is your jaw tight? Has your breathing changed? Are your shoulders tensed? Is your voice louder? Your body usually tells the truth before your words do. Second, number 2, name the emotion, not the other person's behavior, your emotion. Am I embarrassed, afraid, dismissed? Do I feel ashamed or misunderstood? You cannot lead an emotion you refuse to identify. And second 3, ask one question. What am I trying to protect right now? Not how do I prove my point or how do I win? Simply, what am I protecting? Because the answer is rarely your opinion. More often, it's your identity. Second 4, choose your next sentence. Not your fastest sentence, your wisest one. Ask yourself, what kind of relationship do I want my next sentence to build? That single question has the power to redirect an entire conversation. I've watched marriages and individuals being changed, not because someone became better at arguing, but because one person learned to wait 4 seconds before speaking. That's it. Just 4 seconds. Those 4 seconds interrupted assumptions, stopped interruptions, reduced escalation, created enough room for curiosity to fill the space. Eventually, those couples stopped treating every disagreement as a threat to the relationship. They began treating conflict as an opportunity to understand one another more deeply. It wasn't dramatic, but it was disciplined. And one of the greatest shifts you'll ever experience is realizing that understanding another person's experience doesn't require you to abandon your own. You don't have to agree with the criticism. You don't have to accept every interpretation. You don't have to pretend that you weren't hurt too. But you do have to decide whether your first responsibility is protecting yourself or protecting the relationship. Those are not the same things. And emotionally secure people learn that preserving connection often begins with listening before explaining. Think about everything we've explored over these first episodes. We talked about replaying conversations long after they end, repairing conversations after you overreact, saying things that you regret, staying calm when someone pushes your buttons. And now, we've discussed defensiveness. At first, they seem like completely different struggles. But underneath all of them, they point to the same truth. Emotional control isn't about controlling emotion. It's about creating enough space for your values to lead your behavior instead of your emotions leading your decisions. That's what the pause has always been about. Not suppressing emotion, but creating space for wisdom. Every difficult conversation gives you 2 opportunities. First, to defend the person you've always been, or to become the person you've been trying to become. Every pause is a vote, not just for the conversation, but for your identity. Every time you pause, listen, become curious, and choose connection over protection, you're casting another vote for the person you want to become. And eventually, those votes become character. One day, someone you love is going to tell you something that's difficult to hear. Your nervous system will immediately begin writing a story meant to protect yourself, to explain, defend, even win. That voice may never disappear completely. But if you've stayed with me, another voice will begin speaking too. a quieter voice, a steadier voice, one you've been strengthening every time you've chosen to pause instead of react. It will simply whisper, say, listen, understand, and lead. The voice you strengthen will become the voice you live. If today's episode challenged you, don't let it end here. Over the next week, I want you to practice just one thing. Not becoming less emotional, not becoming perfect. Simply noticing the moment your mind begins preparing a defense. When you feel that tightening in your chest, when you start rehearsing your explanation before the other person's even finished speaking, begin to pause, take 4 seconds, and ask yourself, what am I trying to protect right now? You may be surprised by what you discover, because awareness is where emotional control begins. Practice that one question this week, and you'll start hearing conversations differently. And eventually, you'll begin responding differently. Now, if you're ready to move on beyond listening and begin building these skills into your everyday life, visit pauseandrespond.com. You'll find the Pause and Respond workbooks, practical exercises, and additional resources designed to help you become more emotionally steady under pressure. And if this episode resonated with you, would you do me a favor? Follow the podcast, leave a review, and share the episode with someone who means a lot to you. Because chances are, someone in your life isn't trying to be defensive. They're simply trying to protect something they don't know how to name. You may help them begin that journey. Until next time, less reaction, more choice.